Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. Post-fight review, Filip Hrgovic and David Adeleye. Hrgovic, despite a nasty cut received early in the fight in round 2, he goes on to control and dominate portions of the fight. He doesn't escape without some moments of danger, especially in the 8th round, but he goes on to take this one 98-91, 99-90 and 99-90. And the scorecards may actually be a little bit deceptive because there were moments in this one where Adeleye was in the fight, that he was actually causing moments of danger for Filip Hrgovic. But at this sort of level, you would expect that to some extent. But this was a big step up for David Adeleye, and we'll come to that a little bit later on. Ultimately, though, both these guys, and despite the loss for Adeleye, I think his stock goes up a bit, but there's plenty to work on. For Filip Hrgovic, I think this is probably one of the first times that we can actually say something positive about the conditioning, because he threw a lot of punches and he was making the fight and pressing the action, and he was the one controlling how this fight played out. And David Adeleye just didn't have an answer to the volume of punches that Filip Hrgovic was throwing. And with his trainer Abel Sanchez, which he's linked up with recently, obviously getting the benefit of that camp at Big Bear, at altitude, and he didn't sort of go 5 or 6 rounds and then start to fade, which we've seen in fights previously, Zhang Jilei and also Daniel Dubois. There's been other fights where he sort of tapered off, but not so this one. Well, not to the same degree. Certainly was able to keep pressing the action, and I think one of the keys for this fight was Filip Hrgovic was using his height very effectively at times. He was the bigger man here by a few inches for both height and reach, and he did make it count. And David Adeleye, sometimes when he was looking to deploy that left hook, was swinging at air. Hrgovic was able to sort of get out of the way, use his height effectively, but I think the one thing for Filip Hrgovic was the conditioning that really helped dictate this fight, because after the first couple of rounds, I thought Adeleye was actually acquitting himself quite well. It was a pretty even first round. I edged it to Hrgovic, but it was, heading into this one, because Adeleye had only been at domestic level, I was thinking, how's he going to fare here? This is a decent step up for him against a guy who's rated inside the top 10. David Adeleye had fallen short against Fabio Wardley. He'd had other moments where he'd not looked great there, even despite that controversial win against Jamie Shakiva. There were moments in there where he was schooled on the boxing front, but he didn't look out of his depth, and what you could say is a pretty competitive first couple of rounds. Hrgovic was coming on the stronger of the two in the second round, but then Adeleye, with a very stiff jab, he cuts Hrgovic again. And I thought, oh no, he's cut again. What's going to happen here? Is he going to have to go for broke? Because here's a shot from the corner between rounds. It was a nasty cut. Look at it. A lot of times you could probably think that this is going to see the fight end, within a couple of rounds or something like that, because all the damage that would be sustained over time through punches landed on that spot. But I think Hrgovic and his corner deserves some credit. Abel Sanchez for sort of sorting that one out, able to sort of keep it manageable. And I think after about the 4th round, it really wasn't a question, because it wasn't spurting blood. It wasn't necessarily in his eye. It wasn't necessarily always sort of an issue. And later in the fight, it would have been easy to forget that cut had happened. But there was a more urgent Filip Hrgovic from that 3rd round, because obviously he probably didn't know what was going to happen, because it was a bad cut. He looked like he wanted to really put it on Adeleye and try to sort of maintain and really assert an advantage and try to, end the fight. But what happened from there, it didn't sort of go that way. What instead, after round 3, you had Filip Hrgovic just settling into a really good rhythm. David Adeleye has never been a volume puncher, but I think he didn't seem to have a plan B to fall back on, because clearly he was looking to use that left hook, his big right hand, and the left hook's his main weapon, I think. But he was just sort of sitting back and waiting for counter opportunities. But what we had for rounds sort of 4 to 6 especially was Filip Hrgovic just pressing forward, throwing more volume, making Adeleye miss most of the time with that left hook in particular, and Hrgovic was landing shots to body and head. The commentators were sort of describing it as a lot of arm punches, wasn't necessarily really sort of putting his hips into it or sitting down on these punches, but he was busier. He was throwing shots to the body. He was hitting David Adeleye, even if they were caught, they were the cuffing shots. It was all kind of wearing down David Adeleye to some extent. And I thought after, maybe it was round 5 and parts of round 6, I thought Adeleye is looking a bit tired. He wasn't looking as sharp and dynamic. And actually his trainer, Adam Booth, after that round 6, said to him, you know, how badly do you want it? Because, and at that point, he also sort of said, look, this is not going down to points. You're going to have to do something. You know, you're going to have to make the fight here. You're going to, how badly do you want it? And you did see a more aggressive David Adeleye in round 7, but he wasn't able to keep it up. Hrgovic, after a bit of a flurry for the first minute or so from Adeleye, where he was coming forward more aggressive and really looking to land some big shots, you had Hrgovic settling back into his routine. In round 8, and this could be a candidate for round of the year, or at least heavyweight round of the year so far, you had Filip Hrgovic on a tired David Adeleye landing a big right hand. You could see that David Adeleye was affected. Did a little bit of a dance, the sort of Bambi on ice legs, and Hrgovic follows up and another right hand drops Adeleye to the canvas. And until that point, and the commentators had made the point as well, Hrgovic doesn't necessarily punch with a lot of concussive force, but he is a heavy-handed guy, I guess similar to Joe Joyce, where, you know, he throws a lot and eventually it is hurting you. It is going to wear you down, especially the more you tire. And I think Adeleye had felt and absorbed a lot of punishment, and at that point it was too much. He falls to the canvas. And actually after the first right hand, he actually sort of roared at Filip Hrgovic, sort of taunting him to come on, and then he gets put down moments later. So there was a little bit of hilarity in that. But what we saw pretty much immediately after that, Filip Hrgovic tries to jump on him, but it's Adeleye lands a left hook, and you could see that it visibly sort of affects Hrgovic, stuns him to some extent. And then moments later, Adeleye just goes crazy. Left hooks, right hands, and it was one, you know, just alternating between those two punches for, I don't know, it felt like 10 or 15 seconds. He was going crazy with shots. And Hrgovic, to his credit, you know, you got to say that chin is iron. And we know that he took quite a bit of punishment from Daniel Dubois. Obviously, he's taken Zhang Jilei's best as well. So, you know, he's a hard man to stop, let alone put down. And somehow he managed to stay on his feet. And David Adeleye, he looked pretty spent after that. And it was interesting because as Filip Hrgovic started to gain his bearings towards the final moments of that round, he was the one starting to press forward and put it on a very tired-looking David Adeleye. And as you can imagine, the next round, round 9, was pretty quiet by comparison to some of the other rounds earlier in the fight. Round 10, you did have David Adeleye sort of hurt. He looked visibly hurt in the sort of final 10 seconds or so. I think it might have been a right hand. At that stage, obviously, fatigue had caught up with him. But Hrgovic couldn't manage to put him down any further apart from that 8th round. But it was a deserving win for Filip Hrgovic, 98-91, 99-90, 99-90. So, Filip Hrgovic, you know, obviously the benefit of the camp. And I think one of the other things to touch on, he wasn't pressing 250 pounds for this fight. And I've been saying for some time, the best version of Filip Hrgovic is a guy closer to 240. And he did come in for this one almost at 240. So I thought it was a much more appropriate weight, especially for the sort of fighter that he is, but also for the sort of fights that he's going to be in, because I think he is going to have to rely to some extent on his durability, because he is a guy who's got a good chin. He can, you know, with the potential to throw a lot of shots, and we saw the benefit of him being lighter, but also a full camp, and I think having that additional conditioning really helped him in this fight, especially with the number of punches that he threw. I think after 6 rounds, it was something like 211 punches that he'd thrown, and he'd landed. I mean, it was like 3-1 in terms of punches landed, and closer towards the end of the fight, it had closed up a little bit after round 8, after Adeleye went crazy and was just landing shots for fun, and Hrgovic was eating them like Tic Tacs, but he still threw a lot more and landed about double the shots that David Adeleye threw. So I think for David Adeleye, I think his stock goes up a little bit, because I think there were certainly question marks. What was his real level? I mean, the question was, is this too much too soon? And probably the answer is yes. But Hrgovic and Adeleye, it wasn't necessarily a fight where you were like, Adeleye was completely out of his depth or outclassed. I think one of the things, and this is something that Adeleye and his corner are going to have to work on, him and his new trainer, Adam Booth, he needs to throw more shots. But one of the things we noted from earlier in his career, Adeleye doesn't tend to throw a lot of shots, and he had in some of the fights that, Kamil Sokolowski was one, looked like he got tired very quickly. So I think there is a potential gas tank issue that they're trying to mask by him being effectively a counterpuncher. But it became clear from round 4 onwards, for those 3 where Hrgovic just got in a good rhythm and just sort of swept them with a minimum of fuss. He really just picked it up, used his length, nice 1-2s, shots to the body. It was just, chucking in jabs, looping some shots in. He was able to control that easily enough, and Adeleye didn't have a response. He didn't throw enough punches. He wasn't creating enough. There didn't really sort of seem to be a bit of a plan B to go to. But some of that could be because the gas tank potentially, or he just relies too much on being a counter-puncher, looking for that big left hook, which has been money for him in a few fights. So I think there are things to work on for David Adeleye, but I think his stock to some degree goes up. It was an entertaining fight. I enjoyed it. I mean, you could look at it though and go, Hrgovic, who is meant to be a top 10 guy, should he have done a little bit better against David Adeleye? Certainly a question. You did have Fabio Wardley doing a much more conclusive job on Adeleye when they fought. But I guess Wardley, in terms of the one-punch power, probably a bigger hitter, and that showed and that was a difference in that fight. But David Adeleye, very durable. He did show a decent chin in this one, and I think he can come again. And I think his level is certainly probably more European type level. And Filip Hrgovic, in terms of his performance, yeah, it was a decent performance. Maybe he could have done a few things better, but one of the positives, the real positives, was the endurance, the conditioning. It was much better. And a comment on my Twitter after the fight was, Filip Hrgovic, has he regressed? Well, I think the answer to some degree is yes. From his earlier days, especially the amateur days, where he was more of a, there was the comparisons to Vitaly and that sort of stuff. He was more fluid. He was able to sort of be a bit more clinical. They've turned him, through the different trainers and the action that he's had as a pro in these last several years, more into some guy who comes forward and looks to let his right hand go. So, I mean, that's going to be hard to sort of take out of his DNA now. So I think to some degree, Filip Hrgovic is what he is. But with the additional conditioning, he becomes a much tougher guy to beat. He might be a bit more basic than maybe he looked in his final years as an amateur, but the pros, perhaps he wasn't able to maintain that sort of style, or it's been trained out of him. I don't know. But, I think Filip Hrgovic, he might look a little bit basic now, but obviously he's very effective. We saw that against Joe Joyce. We saw that here against David Adeleye. And if you can keep up that pace, and the volume's not an issue because you're not getting as tired as fast, it makes you very tough to beat, because boxing, after all, is to some extent a work rate sport. And that was what laid the path to victory here for Filip Hrgovic. So there are some positives here for both these guys, for Adeleye in defeat and Filip Hrgovic. I think betting in that relationship with Abel Sanchez, and there has been the talk that perhaps he will face the winner of White and Moses Itoma And if Itoma beats White, I'm recording this before that fight, this is a sort of perfect type of fight for Itoma to really sort of see where he's at against a guy who can throw a lot of punches, who's got a decent chin, who we don't consider to be completely washed, that, it would be a good test. And Filip Hrgovic, I'm sure he would fancy himself in that fight to some extent. He picked up a couple of sanctioning body trinkets in this one. I think maintained one, retained one, and picked up another, one for the WBO, one for the WBA, I believe. I think the thing is, if you continue to win and you're on these Riyadh season cards, the fights will come. You don't know necessarily who it will be against, and it may not necessarily be dictated by the sanctioning bodies, but Hrgovic will get some action. He will get a decent fight if he continues to win, and he's done his job here. He's won. What did you make of it all? Enjoyable fight. He overcomes the cut, and I guess that's the other thing as well. The determination to push on, the good corner work. You have to give some props to Abel Sanchez and also Filip Hrgovic to continue to stay disciplined for much of that fight, despite the jeopardy with his eye. And I guess also another red flag for the future, cuts easy. That's always seemingly going to be a feature. You can open up that cut, those eyes again, and I guess he'll be thanking Daniel Dubois for that. Drop a comment, loud and often, hit like, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.